We're looking at Beowulf again, and we've sort of set the stage last time with the fact that it's an Anglo-Saxon poem, that it's an epic, that it's actually very important as one of the central first poems in the English language, even if it's not in the modern English language. Tolkien really puts it at the beginning of the English curriculum, as it were, but even though we associate, or at least I associate, Tolkien and his fellow medievalist C.S. Lewis as part of a traditional approach to the humanities, there's something that is odd about that, and that is that this poem was not actually read in the Renaissance period. It was not known. I don't know when it fell out of memory, but there's no reference to it even in Chaucer, 14th century English. So it just sort of disappears and reemerges in a library in the early 19th century. And it's Tolkien that argues what an important poem it is, and argues that it should be read as an epic alongside some of the great epics in the Greek and Roman traditions, for example. And so it remains a part of English curricula for that reason, by and large. And I agree with Tolkien that it is an important work, and important for English for that matter as well. So I talked about some of the features last time, the ways in which it was like the Greco-Roman epics, but also not like them. And one of them was that it introduces themes of good and evil into the mix, which are not there in the Greek and Roman period. The Carthaginians are the enemies of Rome, but they're not evil. We don't really get that sort of dichotomy presented there. And we don't get it there in the war with the Trojans on the Greek side either. The Trojans are not portrayed as evil, the opponents of the heroes, whereas here the heroes are against evil figures, and the evil figures are not human figures. They represent some sort of distortion of nature or violation against nature, and this is represented by no better figure than Grendel, who is an offspring of Cain. And as I say, we met Cain in the bottom of Dante's Inferno. In fact, that whole area, the deepest pit of hell, was called Caina after him. So a man who is treacherous to his brethren, to his brother. And this is an offspring of him, and he's a monster. And there are other foul creatures mentioned here that walk the earth, and they're opposed to civilization, and they hate the light. Very interesting from a Christian vantage point, because the motifs of light and darkness are very much tied together with God, at least in John's gospel. Jesus is the light of the world, right? The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not comprehended it, understood it. Direct quotations from John's Gospel, John 1, verse 4, 3 and 4, thereabouts. And so that motif of light is connected with God, but also the light of truth and the light of fellowship. And there's, again, in John's Gospel, it talks about those who knew God and had fellowship with him, whereas others rejected him, were cut off from him, etc. All of these things are marking Cain as well. He is a solitary figure, lives in the wilderness, hates the light, and hates everything that is associated with it. So the implication in it, and it is only implies that he hates God, and vice versa. So a strong implicit theological statement about Grendel by a Christian poet whose heroes are nonetheless not Christians. I said that to you, that Beowulf is not, although some of his language is a little anachronistic, and he says things that probably no pagan would have said. Pagans would have referred to the gods. He refers to God in the singular. He's a monotheist. But it's a very artfully crafted story. It's full of repetitions. It begins with the funeral of a king, and it ends with the funeral of a king. These are strong, like if you want to talk about the architecture or the architectonics of the story, the structure. It begins and ends with a funeral. Beowulf was going to have to fight Grendel, but also his mother. There's a tale of Siegmund fighting a dragon that Beowulf seems to follow. And the dragon, of course, has Christian connotations of Satan. Going to Revelation 12, have a look at Revelation 12. Talks about the war on the woman by the dragon and the baby the woman gives birth to, etc. It's a way of understanding Mary and Christ, or Eve and her offspring, the seed. So it again has those at least allusions of stories that are biblical archetypes. And there are all sorts of feuds, blood feuds going on that seem to foreshadow the stories that are going on in Beowulf's times. And there's a continuity, therefore, in the themes that seems to be not just connected to Beowulf's own age, but also to reflect upon our own days. So it's timeless in that sense. There's a war between good and evil going on in the world, and here's how it happened in a time where they did not actually know God, and yet it still was happening for them. And let me, as the Christian bard, illustrate what was really going on there. And so there's, as I say, there's these pattern of similarities, but there's also differences between them. And this is what comparisons do, and this is what I've tried to emphasize on the course, is that by following conventions and genres of literature like the epic, what we get is, and not only is the story itself, but a story held up against another story that we also know, and an implied comparison. Sometimes we're saying this is the same thing, and sometimes there's a contrast going on. Sometimes it's just a little bit different, a little bit more nuanced. Happening here as well. So as I said, it begins with the death of a king and it ends with the death of the king, but the deaths happen very differently. The first king, Scyld, dies of old age, which is the sign that he was a wise king and he lived well. He dies in his bed. He's a good king. He dies like David. Beowulf will die in battle, and he will have no descendants. He's got no dynasty to follow him, where Scyld had a son who carried on his legacy and therefore preserved the peace in the kingdom. Beowulf will not die so. He will die childless and leave the kingdom open to other enemies than the one that he faced. And as I say, that raises the question of, was Beowulf a good king after all? Are all fights the same? Should they be fought in the same way? Should you treat every fight like a warrior does? The enemy's in front of you, and you have to win that battle. Or you should think about more broadly about the consequences if you lose. There are consequences to whether you fight or don't fight. Maybe you can't live with the consequences. Maybe Beowulf had no choice because he's facing a dragon, and a dragon is a form of evil that is so terrible that there is no choice but to fight it, because the dragon will destroy the kingdom. He has no choice. Maybe the dragon actually represents death itself. So of course it's going to kill him. But if he didn't kill it, his kingdom would also fall. So he laid down his life for his kingdom. As I say, there's ambiguity at the end of the epic poem that is not resolved. We're left with questions. But stories that have tight endings, and it's a tight ending because, again, it begins with the death of a king, it ends with the death of a king. It's very clear. The hero has finished his voyage in life, just like Odysseus, who's going to plant an oar in the ground. His journeyings are over, but it's not his death, whereas here it's a death. And the death has given life to his community for at least the next generation. Is there a Christian motif to it there? I don't know. But there's a contrast there for sure, and the contrast is interesting and invites us to think about it some more. So I want to, with those things being stated, let me turn that off so it stops beeping. Let's look at the three fights, the three conflicts brought into the poem between Grendel, Grendel's mother, and then finally the dragon. And I say that even there, the parallelism is comparing dissimilar things, because the first two fights take place while Beowulf is a young man and a warrior with no responsibilities, whereas the third takes place when he's a king, and it's 40 years on, he's an old man, and he has all the weights of his offices on his shoulders. And the consequences of his death are far greater than if he had died as a young warrior. There were still others in place that could preserve the kingdom besides him. Anyway, the first monster that he fights is called Grendel. And probably the most memorable of the three. More time is spent on Grendel in the lead-up, because that's what brings Beowulf to the shores of Denmark to defend his father's friend kingdom. Grendel is a mysterious beast. He seems like a man because he's a descendant of Cain, so there must be something human in him, but there's something deeply grotesque about him. And he seems to have a little bit of an interior life. He hates Herot and everything it represents. Animals don't hate, but he does. This creature hates. So he seems like a man that has been disfigured by the sin of his ancestor and also his own depravity and distance from the good. There's something of an orthodox Augustinian portrait of evil here, in the sense that Augustine said that there's no such thing as evil. What we call evil is the privation of the good, the absence of something good. But insofar as he exists, there is good in Grendel, and insofar as he still is a man, there's something in him that bears the image of God. But he hates it, he hates God, and he has turned his back on his, to God and all of humanity for that matter. So he is a servant of evil. And that's why he hates the light. He hates everything good. And lives in the shadows, in the marshes. Again, a bit like, somebody asked me last time if it was a bit like Gollum, and I think yes. But there's no Smeagol here, there's just Gollum. He's been consumed by his hatred. And he seems to only get respite from his hatred by eating good. And that, again, that is a good metaphor for what evil does. It chews up, swallows, removes the good from the world. I think it's interesting in the light of that. So he has a bit of an interior life that suggests that there is something human about him, even if it's hatred, because hatred is present in things that have the capacity to love. Animals don't hate things. They may prey upon them, but they don't hate them. And Grendel is not motivated by animal motivations. He's motivated by hate. So he's an outcast. And he seemingly longs to be reinstated, and yet at the same time does nothing to bring that about. So he does what people often do when they're wounded which is to isolate themselves. It's a funny old thing. You observe it. I served in pastoral ministry for a while. I've served, I'm old enough now and I've noticed it. People, when they're distressed, they often feel isolated. But they also isolate themselves. They pull themselves away from other people. They if they once were sitting at the front, they move to the back. They move a little bit distant. They don't associate with others, they don't have fellowship with others, etc. And they feel the consequences of their own decisions. And at the same time, they don't take any responsibility for that. So something psychologically true about the way Beowulf, or rather Grendel, acts here. But we hear that the reason why Grendel is aggressive against the Dane lies in his loneliness and also in his jealousy. So it says that he is a member, and this was back at the beginning, he's a member of Cain's clan, whom the Lord had outlawed and condemned as outcast. So he has been cast out. But if you look at the story of Cain very carefully, Cain chooses to wander as well. It's his choice. He doesn't want to stay. He wants to go and he wants to found a city of his own, which he then does. So he's descended from a figure that epitomizes this resentment, this malice in his character. And so there's an ambiguity. I mean, whoever the author is of this poem, as I say, we don't know. There's a bit of sympathy for Grendel, because he's been exiled from fellowship, but at the same time, he says that he's malignant by nature. And he's never shown remorse. This is part of what makes him so monstrous. There's no sympathy, there's no pity, there's no remorse for anything he's ever done. I think that's interesting. So as we look at this, the introduction of the story is presented as part 4 here, but just the lead up is interesting to read what the Beowulf poet has to say here. Let me read this. To his native place and the people who reared him, they knew too well the way it was before, how often the Danes had fallen prey to death in the mead hall. But the Lord was weaving a victory on his war loom for the weather yachts. Through the strength of one, they all prevailed. They would crush their enemy and come through in triumph and gladness. The truth is clear. Almighty God rules over mankind and always has. Interesting that there is almost a messianic aspect to Beowulf here. He is a representative. He is the seed of the woman who will crush the head of the serpent. Now here we don't have the serpent, but we will have the serpent at the end in the form of the dragon. I wouldn't want to overstate this, that it's not like he has a strong Christological emphasis on Beowulf, but there's something there. And also the Lord's direction of him in this, and his predestination about what's about to happen. Very interesting that the poet should introduce this in the poem in this fashion. Then it swiftly moves on. Then out of the night came the shadow stalker, stealthy and swift. The hall guards were slack, asleep at their posts, all except one. It was widely understood. Even there, you can spot a biblical reference. Remember, Jesus asks his disciples to stay awake, and they all keep falling asleep, and he's the only one left awake. Same thing here. All except one. It was widely understood that as long as the Lord forbade it, the fiend could never bear them beyond his shadow born. One man, however, was in fighting mood, awake and on edge, spoiling for action. In off the moors, down through the mist bands, God-cursed Grendel came greedily loping. The bane of the race of men roamed forth, hunting for a prey in the high hall. Under the cloud murk he moved towards it until it shone above him, a sheer keep of fortified gold. Note how it's not actually made of gold, but it is presented as if it were. It's like a sanctuary, like the Jewish temple, inlaid with gold. And he hates that shining city almost representative of the forces that oppose the heavenly Jerusalem. I'm reading a bit into it here, but nor was that the first time he had scouted the grounds of Hrothgar's dwelling, although never in his life, before or since, did he ever find harder fortune or hall defenders. Spurned and joyless. Note how the narrator builds the anticipation by telling us what's going to happen before the fact. We know what's going to happen. Does it spoil the story? No, it does not. Just like in a horror movie, you know what's going to happen next. That doesn't remove the suspense. Again, all the great stories that have ever been told, once you've heard it once, you know what's going to happen. Does it remove the delight of the story? Absolutely not. Because it's in the telling that we take delight. The action we also delight in here because good is going to triumph over evil. This is a delightful thing. And it's not diminished by knowing that it's going to happen. The iron-braced door turned on its hinge when his hand touched it. Then his rage boiled over. He ripped open the mouth of the building, maddening for blood, pacing the length of the patterned floor with his loathsome tread, while a baleful light, flame more than light, flared from his eyes. He saw many men in the mansion sleeping, a ranked company of kinsmen and warriors quartered together, and his glee was demonic. Picturing the mayhem, before morning, he would rip life from limb and devour them, feed on their flesh. Sounds a bit like Tolkien. The Balrog, feast on their flesh. Yeah, you eat, and it's horrifying. Right? Tolkien's echoing that plainly. And you will find that actually when you read medieval literature, you'll see that that Tolkien's imagination is taking certain phrases and scenes and images and bringing them into his story. And here, but note that he is demonic. Again, this is not a monster's or a creature's, a mere animal's response. He takes delight in doing evil, which is demonic. Clearly presented in terms that are theological. And they're waiting for the monster to come. I'll skip just a few words. Venturing closer, his talon, what sort of creature is this? He's got a talon like an eagle. He's got a claw in it. Terrifying. His talon was raised to attack Beowulf where he lay on the bed. He was bearing in with open claw when the alert heroes come back, an arm lock forestalled him utterly. The captain of evil discovered himself in a hand grip harder than anything he had ever encountered in any man on the face of the earth. Every bone in his body quailed and recoiled, but he could not escape. He was desperate to flee to his den and hide with the devil's litter, for in all his days he had never been clamped or cornered like this. Then Hugelax's trusty retainer recalled his bedtime speech, sprang to his feet and got a firm hold. Fingers were bursting, the monster backtracking, the man overpowering. The dread of the land was desperate to escape, to take a roundabout road and flee to his lair in the fens. The latching power in his fingers weakened. It was the worst trip the terror-monger had taken to Heorot, and now the timbers trembled and sang. A hall session had harrowed every Dane inside the stockade. Stumbling in fury, the two contenders crashed through the building. You can imagine them in grip, smashing against the walls, turning around. The hall clattered and hammered, but somehow survived the onslaught and kept standing. It was handsomely structured, a sturdy frame braced with the best of blacksmith's work inside and out. The story goes that as the pair struggled, mead benches were smashed and sprung off the floor, gold fittings and all. Before then, no shielding elder would believe there was any power or person on earth capable of wrecking their horn-rigged hall unless the burning embrace of fire engulfed it in flame. Then an extraordinary wail arose, and bewildering fear came over the Danes. Everyone felt it, who heard that cry as it echoed off the wall. A god cursed scream and strain of catastrophe, the howl of the loser, the lament of the hell serf keening his wound. He was overwhelmed, manacled tight by the man who, of all men, was foremost and strongest in the days of his life. But they go on and on and on and on, and at that point, Beowulf's soldiers spring into the fray and bring out their swords to aid Beowulf. But they don't realize, line 798, they kept striking out on every side, seeking to cut straight to the soul. When they joined the struggle, there was something they could not have known at the time, that no blade on earth, no blacksmith's art could ever damage their demon opponent. He had conjured the harm from the cutting edge of every weapon. Now, this is a strange thing. We're dealing with something supernatural now. This is not just a beast. As I say, there's man, and there's more than man, there's monster, but there's more than monster. We have something demonic here that has managed to curse or conjured a spell such that blades cannot penetrate his skin. He's invulnerable. Beowulf didn't know it, they didn't know it. But now they're facing an enemy who is girded with the strength of witchcraft, if you will. But his going away out of this world in the days of his life would be agony to him, and his alien spirit would travel far into the fiend's keeping. Then he who had harrowed the hearts of men with pain and affliction in former times and given offense also to God, found that his bodily powers failed him. Hugelax's kinsman kept him helplessly locked in a hand grip. As long as either lived, he was hateful to the other. The monster's whole body was in pain. A tremendous wound appeared on his shoulder. Sinews split, and the bone lappings burst. Just like the door that gets exploded into at the beginning when the monster decides that he's going to touch the door, and then he pulls it off and it explodes. His shoulder explodes off of his shoulder. And in the Anglo-Saxon, there's the pop, pop, pop sound of the consonants as his bone lappings pop off his shoulder. And it's Beowulf was granted the glory of winning. Grendel was driven under the fen banks, fatally hurt to his desolate lair. His days were numbered. The end of his life was coming over him. He knew it for certain. And one bloody clash he had fulfilled the dearest wish of the Danes. The man who had lately landed among them, proud and sure, had purged the hall, kept it from harm. He was happy with his night work and the courage he had shown. The yacht captain had boldly fulfilled his boast to the Danes. He had healed and relieved a huge distress, unremitting humiliations, the hard fate they'd been forced to undergo, no small affliction. And so what does he do? He takes the shoulder and arm and pops it on the wall of the hall. It's a trophy. You see the boar's head on the wall. You see the deer's head, the antlers. Here's the arm on the side. Trophy. You can sit there drinking on the mead benches and talk about the great Beowulf ripping the arm off Grendel. Oh, you don't need to put your, literally a trophy or some sort of a flag or whatever on the wall. You've got an arm with a talon on it. Beowulf has now boasted that he is a great hero, and his boasts have not been in vain. He is the hero he said he was. And remember I said about the flighting that he had suffered from Unferth before. Well, now we're going to find something rather different here. In the fifth part, which is as the light of day comes, because this is all happening in darkness, everyone realized what's happened. Remember, in the ancient world, they don't have obviously no electric light, but they don't even have candle lights here. This is happening in the dark. There's a lot of noise. What are we going to see when we wake up? We heard wailing, screaming, crashing like never before. What is the light going to betray? What do we find? Well, the light of day broke and kept brightening. It kept on getting brighter. The light got lighter. Something metaphorical being said here again. Bands of retainers galloped in excitement to the gabled hall to see the marvel, and the king himself, guardian of the ring hoard, goodness in person, walked in majesty from the women's quarters with a numerous train attended by his queen and her crowd of maidens across the mead hall. So now they know that they are safe and secure. They knew, but now they can see. And they are going to allow the women folk back in. Remember, before everybody was fleeing the hall. They were dispersing out of terror. Nothing can stop Beowulf, but now nothing can stop Grendel, but now Beowulf has done that. And there's something rather amusing about the king coming out from the women's quarters to see the spectacle that ensues. When Hrothgar arrived at the hall, he spoke, standing on the steps under the steep eaves, gazing at the roofwork and Grendel's talon. First and foremost, let the Almighty Father be thanked for this sight. I suffered a long harrowing by Grendel, but the heavenly shepherd can work his wonders always and everywhere. So again, very anachronistic. Speaking of God in the form of there's one God, and also as a heavenly shepherd. Clearly Christian influences. Christian poet giving Christian language to a king who would not have been so. Interesting, in terms of Christ and culture. Is this cultural, is this foisting your culture on another culture? Is this these days there's a lot of discussion about cultural appropriation, and also of imposing your system of beliefs on others. Some think it violates the principle of human integrity, human autonomy to do this. That's not the historic position of anyone, that we have that sort of autonomy. And of course you are going to look at the world from the vantage point of your theology. I don't think it's avoidable. It was there in the ancient epics we saw already, the Greco-Roman epics. Of course they see through the lens of their theology. And so does our culture, actually. Our culture's identity is self-identification. Right? We announce who we are and insist that everybody self-identify. Well, that's a religious point of view. It's the religious point of view of each individual being a god who reveals his or her or whatever pronoun you want, their nature. And the rest of us have to accept that data. Well, it's a form of theology. And the fact that everybody else has to acknowledge it shows that it's an intolerant form of theology. I won't allow for any other theologies there, but make no mistake, it is a theological vantage point to insist that self-identification has that sort of integrity and importance that everyone else must acknowledge it. It is a claim to divinity. And it's being imposed on everyone else. So it's maybe called tolerance to accept it, but it's highly intolerant if you don't. We're still living that out right now. But this is what's happening here, is that a pagan king is being given Christian language by the Christian poet. Clearly anachronistic. Has an understanding of how good and evil work, and those good and evil things work in relation to the nature of God. What's God like? What does God understand about the world? How does he relate to people? How does he expect them to relate to one another? Do they revere life or do they hate life? Do they live in the light or do they prefer the darkness? Do they live in isolation or do they live in community? What's clear is that Beowulf is almost like an emissary from God. God has sent Beowulf there. It says, but now a man, with the Lord's assistance, has accomplished something none of us could manage before now for all our efforts. Whoever she was who brought forth This flower of manhood, if she is still alive, that woman can say that in her labors the Lord of ages bestowed a grace on her. So now, Beowulf, I adopt you in my heart as a dear son. Nourish and maintain this new connection, you noblest of men. There'll be nothing you'll want for, no worldly good that won't be yours. I have often honored smaller achievement, recognized warriors not nearly as worthy, lavished rewards on the less deserving. But you have made yourself immortal by your glorious action. May the God of ages continue to keep and requite you well. So quite the speech from Hrothgar. He acknowledges and really adopts him as his son. Very close, a king, and somebody who is a servant to him, but he brings him in and bequeaths upon him something akin to sonship. Makes him an heir. Eventually he will become the king because of this act. Remember, he's part of the heroic code. This is the heroic age we're talking about. A man who is aware of the privileges of power and also the dangers of power. And reflect on the differences as well. Remember when I said that the epic is encyclopedic as well. This reflects on the differences between young age and old age as well. There are virtues that come with being young. There are virtues that come with being old. They're not the same. They're complementary. They should work together. The young and the old ought to be of one accord and working together. The youth ought to be deferent to the wisdom of the elder. The elder ought to revere and reward the valor of the younger. And that's how Hrothgar relates to Beowulf here. This character of Unferth, I mentioned him. It's interesting because it's part of the heroic code. Unferth had disparaged Beowulf, had questioned whether the stories told about Beowulf were actually true. He says he doesn't believe it. And Beowulf decides not to fight him at the time, although he could have. Remember Odysseus, same thing happens in the Hall of the Phaeacians. Again, a man comes forward and decides to chirp him, a little smack talk, prelude to a fight. Unferth is presented as a lesser man, and as he's a sort of a foil for Beowulf. So here we have a man of the court, and here we have a man outside the court. The man outside of the court is going to do what no one within the court could do. Maybe Unferth is a bit like Grendel. He's envious. He's motivated by jealousy. He's a weaker man. He doesn't have enough faith in God. He doesn't have enough courage. By the way, a foil in drama serves as a way of illustrating the virtues of a different character. So you get two very similar characters. Sometimes in Shakespeare, they're often presented as twins in some of his comedies, but even in other his plays, you'll see characters that are foils for one another. So in Hamlet, I don't know what Shakespearean plays you're familiar with. You could tell me, but in Hamlet, we have Hamlet, but then we have Horatio, his friend. We also have Ophelia's brother, whose name temporarily escapes me. What's Ophelia's brother's name? Laertes, thank you. Was a sort of a foil for him. He's the man of action. And even more strongly so, a figure by the name of Fortinbras, strong in arms, who's the action hero that Hamlet wants to be, but isn't. Hamlet's reflective. He won't do what needs to be done. He won't take action. He sits around, he hems and haws, he worries about things, he thinks about things, he contemplates things, but he isn't able to act. Fortinbras is strong in arms and able to act. They're foils for one another. Is Hamlet a hero, or is he a flawed hero? He's the hero, but he has flaws. He dies. There's a tragedy about it. He could have acted, but he didn't. He was impeded by his own self-reflection, by his anxiety, his fears about the afterlife and so forth. Unferth is that sort of foil here. And there's a bitterness about him that, again, is also true of Grendel, but just on a lesser scale. So what it illustrates, interestingly, is that the evil which characterizes Grendel is not restricted to those that are outside the community. It's also true of those within it. So if you want to talk about good and evil, it's not wholly good and wholly evil. They go to extremes, and when they're in their extremes, they become absolutely predatory. But in their nascence, even the good characters have this weakness and flaw in them. And he's probably ashamed that he's not able to be the man that Beowulf is. And interestingly, at the end of this, he has to acknowledge that Beowulf is everything that he said he was. So he has to swallow his pride. And he does, to his credit. And more interestingly, he gives a gift. And the gift is important, because this gift is a sword. This is a very important gift. Because he initially showed Beowulf great contempt. He's supposed to greet him with hospitality. He shows him the opposite. We already saw how that worked in the Odyssey. Hospitality is the expectation. You've treated your guest with contempt. He makes up for it by giving him a great gift. And that sword will help Beowulf in his next fight. And he doesn't know that. And we don't know that either. But it's the means by which the god who is presented to be orchestrating the action is going to carry the narrative forward. But it doesn't mean that Wiglaf is a heroic character, because he remains cowering and sniveling and afraid. But it does show something of an acknowledgement, at least, that Beowulf is the man that he said he was. And so his heroism is being affirmed within the context of the story. So they're in the mead hall. There's a reward. They're singing to please the hero, words and music for the warrior prince, harp tunes and tales of adventure, and a song of Hnaef, king of the Danes, and his sister Hildebert, who suffered cruelty. So they hear a story about another figure in the deep past who bears resemblance to Beowulf. Beowulf will be gathered on this, but this is presented in poetic form here. Because I've blown it up, it doesn't look appropriate, but this is clearly in the form of a song in the midst of the poetry. Very much like Tolkien, who will talk about old stories of Elbereth, Gilthoniel, etc. When talking about Aragorn, he'll bring back old lore, old legend, singing them in the hall. Everyone will know the old stories, be cheered by the ongoing providential care of the gods, God, whatever, however it's being presented in the lives of today. So a continuity between past and present, being sung and celebrated. Skip over all that. You see it goes on for some length. Sorry to skip over it, actually, because it's an important part of the poem. And in the even the film version of The Lord of the Rings, they cut those out, you'll notice. They're just gone. There's actually quite a bit they cut. It goes for 12 hours, and they still cut huge amounts. I wish they'd kept some of the things myself. But, and it's important to their identity as a company that they are connected through song and remembrance to events of the past. I think that is something that's gravely lacking in people today. They don't sing songs that connect them with people that went before them. They sing new songs. Our own songs. Let me make a song. Make up a song. How does the song, does it express what? It expresses you. Does it express your continuity with those that went before you? Is there a solidarity there? Is there a human community? The human community is part of your identity, actually. It's a strong root for your identity. It means that you don't think of yourself as an orphan. Anyway, the poem's over. Queen spoke to Hrothgar, "Enjoy this drink, my most generous lord. Raise up your goblet, entertain the yachts. Duly and gently discourse with them, be open-handed, happy and fond, relish their company. But recollect as well all of the boons that have been bestowed upon you. The bright court of Heorot has been cleansed, and now the word is that you want to adopt this warrior as a son. So while you may, bask in your fortune, then bequeath kingdom and nation to your kith and kin." The wife is wise, gives good counsel to her husband. All the youth sat together, and that good man, Beowulf the Yacht, sat between the brothers. So they become, and what are they given? They're given a torque, like a necklace around him. This is a high, bestowing high favor. Wear it for luck, and also wear this mail from our people's armory, says the queen. The queen approves. Here is our son. We will adopt him into our family. They move on, but as they find, the malice of evil did not reside in only one figure. Grendel's mother is also is lurking off stage, and we'll come on to it. Question there before I move to that. It's okay. It's okay. Within the poem there is. He comes from the people called the Yats. They're up in Sweden. And he's crossed the sea to get to Denmark. Historically, the two nations often go from one king to the next, in the same way that in the Middle Ages, England and France often have exchanged kings. The king of France is at times the king of England, and vice versa, at different stages. And so though they're different, and they're not nations as we understand them now, but they're peoples. But there's a connection through kingship at different stages, and sometimes they're hostile, sometimes they're friendly, sometimes they're seen as kindred, sometimes they're seen as enemies. It varies from period to period, but he comes from the area that we now call Sweden, the south of Sweden. That's where the Yats, G-E-A-T, come from. But the problem, as I say, with evil is not limited to Grendel, but also his mother. Now, his mother is different than Grendel, obviously. She's his mother. But in the sense that she seems to be more wicked, more perverse, more distressing in some ways. And this will be displayed particularly in the location in which the battle takes place, which is deep down the bottom of the sea. In biblical symbolism, the sea doesn't just refer to a body of water. It takes on associations of evil as time passes. And the Hebrews are, as a consequence, afraid of the sea. It's really interesting. If you think about Israel, where it's located on the Mediterranean, they can sail on the Mediterranean like every other country on the Mediterranean, but they don't. They don't do it. There's an association with evil. I think that's one of the reasons that explains that. It's not like they're afraid of swimming, afraid of the water. The fishermen up in Galilee are on a body of water as well. It's not that per se, but the sea has come to symbolize a sort of evil that opposes God and his ways, and I think there might be something of that retained here. At any rate, it's not just the sea, it's the bottom of the sea. It goes down into the pit. And Beowulf's, or Grendel's mother, has her lair there. That's where she lives. Deep down there, plunges down there. And Grendel's mother, 1258, monstrous hell bride, brooded on her wrongs. She had been forced down into fearful waters, the cold depths, after Cain had killed his father's son, felled his own brother with a sword. Branded an outlaw, marked by having murdered, he moved into the wilds, shunning company and joy. And from Cain there sprang misbegotten spirits, among them Grendel, the banished and accursed. But now his mother had sallied forth on a savage journey, grief-racked and ravenous. Desperate for revenge, she came to Heorot and does the same thing. You thought that was all over. Grendel's been defeated, and now here it comes again. Inside the hall, the Danes lay asleep, earls who would soon know a great reversal once Grendel's mother attacked and entered. Then in the hall, hard-honed swords were grabbed from the bench, many a broad shield lifted and braced. There was little thought of helmets or woven mail when they awoke in terror. The Helldam was in panic, desperate to get out, in mortal terror the moment she was found. She had pounced and taken one of the retainers in a tight hold, then headed for the fen. The fen is a marsh or a bog. To Hrothgar, this man was the most beloved of the friends he trusted between the two seas. She had done away with a great warrior, ambushed him at rest. Beowulf was elsewhere. So she only takes one man, but the one man she takes is the king's most beloved friend, most trusted advisor. A grievous wound to the king. And she takes with her Grendel's arm off the side. You're not going to take glory over my son and me. I'm taking that with me. This is not your prize. I will take this. She had snatched their trophy, Grendel's bloodied hand. It was a fresh blow to the afflicted Vaughan. The bargain was hard, both parties having to pay with the lives of friends. Reciprocity. The king, Grendel's mother, both lose their favored. One loses a son, the other loses his most trusted advisor. Bitter. Beowulf was quickly brought to the chamber. The winner of fights, the arch warrior, came first footing in his fellow troops to where the king in his wisdom awaited, still wondering whether Almighty God would even turn the tide of his misfortunes. Note that for all the victory that has just been won, when you lose your closest, dearest friend, you wonder whether anything can stem the terrible evil. He's in despair. Beowulf comes. Hrothgar, the shielding's helmet, spoke, the thing that protects their head, that protects the people. Rest. What is rest? Sorrow has returned. Alas for the Danes. Eshere is dead. He was Ermenlaf's elder brother and a soul mate to me, a true mentor, my right-hand man when the ranks clashed and our boar crests had to take a battering in the line of action. Eshere was everything the world admires in a wise man and a friend. Then this roaming killer came in a fury and slaughtered him in Heorot. Where she is hiding, glutting on the corpse and glorying in her escape, I cannot tell. She has taken up the feud because of last night when you killed Grendel, wrestled and racked him in ruinous combat, since for too long he had terrorized us with his depredations. He died in battle, paid with his life. And now this powerful other one arrives, this force for evil driven to avenge her kinsman's death. I have heard it said by my people in Hull, counselors who live in the upland country, that they have seen two such creatures prowling the moors, huge marauders from some other world. One of these things, as far as anyone ever can discern, looks like a woman. The other, warped in the shape of a man, moves beyond the pale, bigger than any man, an unnatural birth called Grendel by the country people in former days. They are fatherless creatures, and their whole ancestry is hidden in a past of demons and ghosts They dwell apart among wolves on hills, on windswept crags, and treacherous caches where cold streams pour down the mountain, disappear under mist and moorland. So they have heard about Grendel's mother. There's no mention of it thus far. It was like an old wives' tale. They didn't want to believe that it was true, that there were two. But now we hear that. Now Grendel has, or rather Beowulf has not been acquainted with this fact as of yet, and neither has the reader. They didn't even want to entertain the idea that there's more evil, but now we have the truth come out. Help depends on you and you alone. The gap of danger where the demon waits is still unknown to you. Seek it if you dare, says the king. I will compensate you for settling the feud as I did last time with lavish wealth, coffers of coiled gold if you come back. Beowulf speaks like the warrior. Wise sir, do not grieve. It is always better to avenge dear ones than to indulge in mourning. For every one of us living in this world means waiting for our end. When a warrior is gone, that will be his best and only bulwark. So arise, my lord, and let us immediately set forth on the trail of this troll dam. I guarantee you she will not get away. Not to dens underground, nor upland groves, nor the ocean floor she'll have nowhere to flee to. Note that he refers to, I will find her wherever she is, but he refers to the bottom. However far down she goes, I will seek her out. Implication by this is that she is a far worse evil. She dwells in the darkness of the deep. And Beowulf's heroism extends that far down as well. He will go down where no man can descend. And he pledges. Note again, the promises are taken as pledges, as oaths. I talked about this last time, about the importance of troth. He's swearing that he will do this. He's already proved to be a man of his word. He swears it again. In response, Hugelac shows his delight. I know you're a man of your word. You swear to do this. I know you will do what you say. So off he goes, dons his war gear. Last time he wore no armor. Decided he was going to fight without armor. This time he puts on armor. That was a one-time thing. Puts on armor this time and he takes the sword. The item lent by Unferth. And it was a rare and ancient sword named Hrunting, 1458. The iron blade with its ill-boding patterns had been tempered in blood. It had never failed the hand of anyone who had hefted it in battle, anyone who had fought and faced the worst in the gap of danger. This was not the first time it had been called to perform heroic feats. So he swears and goes on and sees the Tarn hag and swings the sword at her and finds the sword doesn't bite. It doesn't actually penetrate her either. This is a problem. He soon found his battle torch extinguished. The shining blade refused to bite. It spared her and failed the man in his need. He throws the sword away and decides hand-to-hand combat. Okay, well, we're thinking very good things about that because we've already seen this man's so strong he can rip a monster's arm off. Surely he's going to defeat the female figure. Wrong. That doesn't happen. He finds that the Tarn hag is his equal. He tries the old thing. I'm going to do the shoulder thing. Oh, that's not working. I've seen this in Marvel superhero movies, right? They get when you get the grip on you, it's all over. Or some WWE wrestlers. Oh, he's got the grip on. It's got the grip. No one's ever broken the grip. There you go. The grip has been broken. Gripped her shoulder and laid about him in a battle frenzy. He pitched his killer opponent to the floor, but she rose quickly and retaliated, gripped him tightly in her grim embrace. The sure-footed fight felt suddenly daunted. The strongest of warriors stumbled and fell. She pounced upon him and pulled out a broad, whetted knife. Now she would avenge her only child. But the mesh of the chainmail on Beowulf's shoulder shielded his life, turned the edge and tip of the blade. The son of Ecthio would surely have perished, and the Yats lost their warrior under the wide earth, had the strong lengths and locks of his war gear not helped to save him. That's one way of looking at it. The other is, holy God decided the victory. So note there's a natural explanation and there's a supernatural explanation. They go right side by side. It was easy for the Lord, the ruler of heaven, to redress the balance once Beowulf got back on his feet. Then he saw a blade that boded well, a sword in her armory, an ancient heirloom. Note that the oldest swords are the best swords. There's a sense that part of the descent of evil is that the world gets worse and worse, not better and better. We don't get stronger, we get weaker over age. The best men lived in the past. Their weapons were best. This was from the days of the giants, an ideal weapon, one that any warrior would envy, but so huge and heavy of itself, only Beowulf could wield it in battle. So the Shielding's hero, hard-pressed and enraged, took a firm hold of the hilt and swung the blade in an arc, a resolute blow that bit deep into her neck bone and severed it entirely. Toppling the doomed house of her flesh, she fell to the floor. The sword dripped blood. The swordsman was elated. Chops off her head. Goes back. Guess what he has? Trophy. Arms and heads. Wall. Feasting. Of course. The golden hilt handed over. They come back and happiness is restored. And there we go again. Eating, drinking, and merriment. Rah, rah, rah. Time goes by. Second fight. Time passes between the second and the third. It's a very interesting thing. It's not just an account of good against evil. It is a study in strength. It's a study in wisdom. As I say, it begins with kings, it ends with kings. Death of a king, death of a king. One dies of old age, the other dies of a wound that he suffers from a beast that even the great legendary Beowulf cannot survive. You are strong in body, says Hrothgar, and mature in mind, impressive in speech. If it should come to a pass that Hrethel's descendant dies beneath the spear, if deadly battle or the sword blade or disease fells the prince who guards your people, and you are still alive, then I firmly believe the sea-faring Yats won't find a man worthy of acclaim as their king and defender than you. If only you would undertake the lordship of your homeland. My liking for you deepens with time, dear Beowulf. What you have done is to draw two peoples, the Yat nation and us, neighboring Danes, into shared peace and a pact of friendship in spite of hatred. So what has happened is Hurot, which represented civilization, and the human community that is forged through that has expanded because of the workness of good. Evil has been pushed away. People are no longer fleeing the light. They're gathering. The light is growing. The community of fellowship, the enmity amongst men is also being dispelled through this. And each side will treat the other with gifts. Across the gannet's bath, gannet's a type of bird, the sea. Over the broad sea, world prows will bring presents and tokens. I know your people are beyond reproach in every respect, steadfast in the old way with friend or foe. So they give him treasures, and off he goes. I'll skip over this to come to the third battle, because time passes, and how long? As I say, 40 years. But he goes back, talks about Oshere, Hujilak. 2200. A lot was to happen in later days in the fury of battle. Hugelac, the king that he'd come to, fell, and the shelter of Herodred's shield proved useless against the fierce aggression of the Schilflings. This is a neighboring tribe. So the kingdom has fallen from hostile tribes. Ruthless swordsmen, seasoned campaigners, they came against him and his conquering nation, and with cruel force cut him down, so that afterwards the wide kingdom reverted to Beowulf. That's a lot of history being collapsed into a short sentence. He ruled it well. I'm wrong. It's not 40, it's 50. For 50 winters. Now, 50 winters, that's a way of saying 50 years. But 50 winters has different connotations than 50 years. What do you associate with the winter? These are hard times. These are not easy times. If it's 50 summers, that's enjoyable. Life's easy, weather's warm, crops grow, life flourishes. 50 winters, these are hard years. And he ruled it well, grew old and wise as warden of the land, until one day, one began to dominate the dark, a dragon on the prowl. From the steep vaults of a stone-roofed barrow where he guarded a hoard. A barrow is a burial place. In Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, there's a barrow wight. He meets very early on. And this dragon is there guarding his hoard. Why do dragons guard their hoard? I have no idea, but they do. And they know everything that they possess, and they're very jealous of their accumulated wealth. They regard their own honor very highly. And there was a hidden passage unknown to men, but someone managed to enter by it and interfere with the heathen trove. If this reminds you of The Hobbit, there's good reason. He's taken it directly from this. He had handled and removed a gem-studded goblet. It gained him nothing, though with a thief's wiles he had outwitted the sleeping dragon. That drove him into rage, as the people of that country would soon discover. The intruder who broached the dragon's treasure that moved him to wrath had never meant to. It was desperation on the part of a slave, fleeing the heavy hand of some master, guilt-ridden and on the run, going to ground. Isn't this interesting? A terrible evil comes about by somebody pushed not out of a wicked heart, but out of desperation. He's so poor. He's scrabbling around trying to find treasure anywhere. Like one of those people looking for treasure on the beach with the things, metal detector. They need something. He needs something. He has no means. He is a thief, but he's not a thief because of his bad character. He just chances upon it. And it unleashes an evil he does not even imagine. But he soon began to shake with terror. In shock, the wretch panicked and ran away with the precious metalwork. There were many other heirlooms heaped into the earth house, because long ago, with deliberate care, some forgotten person had deposited the whole rich inheritance of a high-born race in that ancient cache. Isn't that interesting? It points back to an earlier society, another tale, and it's a forgotten tale. That would be another story unto itself. Somebody has here given a repository of great riches, clearly somebody who was great in the world, and yet is now forgotten. And all that's left is the treasure, and who guards the treasure? Not good men, but a wicked dragon. Death had come and taken them all in times gone by, and the one surviving witness of their fate, the last veteran, could envisage only the same fate for himself. He foresaw that his joy into the treasure would be brief. So we get a sense here, and this is characteristic of Norse literature and Anglo-Saxon, of doom in the future. Not heaven, not deliverance, but of ever approaching and inevitable, what the Norse call Ragnarok. Now, this is not Ragnarok here, but destruction and doom. It is coming. There's a sense of inevitability. Evil will one day swallow up the good. You can hold back the evil through works of light and works of goodness, but eventually evil will win. That is the backdrop for the Christian Beowulf poet writing. He's writing against that sense of doom and inevitability. And the dragon represents death, which is that sort of Ragnarok. It is doom. Death comes to all. In the end, you can't hold that back. It comes, and you will not win. You will die. And Beowulf is facing up to that fight. Now, as I said, there's a question of whether he's a good king or not. I think there's some ambiguity about it, for reasons I've said already. But on the other side, I think the dragon represents more than simply another monster. The dragon does represent death. And he does kill the dragon. He also dies. But note that he defeats the dragon. This is no small thing. But the one who took the keeper of the hoard had carried all the goods and golden ware worth preserving. His words were few. And now what did he say? The one who laid all this treasure there. Now, earth, hold what earls once held, and heroes can no more. It was mined from you first by honorable men. My own people had been ruined in war. One by one they went down to death, looked their last on sweet life in the hall. I am left with nobody to bear a sword or burnish plated goblets, put a sheen on the cup. The company have departed. The hard helmet, hasped with gold, will be stripped of its hoop. And the helmet shiner who would polish the metal of the war mask sleeps. The coat of mail that came through all fights, through shield collapse and cut of sword, decays with the warrior. Nor may webbed mail range far and wide on a warlord's back beside his mustered troops. No trembling harp, no tuned timber, no tumbling hawk swerving through the hall, no swift horse pawing the courtyard. Pillage and slaughter have emptied the earth of entire people, so he mourned as he moved about the world, deserted and alone, lamenting his unhappiness day and night until death's flood brimmed up in his heart. Where is the horse and the rider? How has it come to this? It's all come down to ruin. So the greatness of that is done by men is fleeting. It's very brief. And now it's come so that the last man that's left that buries the treasure is very similar to who? Grendel. He's alone. He's isolated. There's no human community left. The good and the evil seem to have the same outcome. So there's a deep sense of futility almost. Certainly of doom and gloom. Not characteristic of the ancient Greco-Roman epic. It's not there. Remember, we didn't see that. Here it is. There's evil, and the evil wins. It's not Christian. It's not Christian sentiment. The good and the evil are. The tone there. But the sense of doom there. But note the twist in the tale. As I say, Beowulf just kills the dragon. This is a note of hope and very much against the idea of the inevitability of death and the doom that comes with it, because the dragon is killed. But he comes upon that, he comes upon the treasure, the dragon is awoken, and he is angered, and he sees the footprints of the prowler who had stolen too close to his dreaming head. So may a man not marked by fate easily escape exile and woe by the grace of God. The horde guardian, on the other hand, is outraged and belches flames on the village and is starting to burn everything. And Beowulf comes and he gathers up and thinks about what he should do. Now, he's a king. Like, if it's old Beowulf, he just jumps into action. Here I go. He can't do that. He's 50 years older. He's also the king. He thinks It threw the hero into deep anguish and darkened his mood. The wise man thought he must have thwarted ancient ordinance of the eternal Lord, broken his commandment. He, Beowulf, I must have done something to merit this. His mind was in turmoil. Unaccustomed anxiety and gloom confused his brain. The fire dragon had razed the coastal region and reduced forts and northward to dust and ashes. How will I do it? Well, he plots revenge. He sits down. He said, I risked my life, 23:11, when I was young. Now I am old, but as king of the people, I shall pursue this fight for the glory of winning, if the evil one will abandon his earth fort and face me in the open. And so he calls his men before him, and they agree to join him. I'm running out of time. They go out in battle with him, and 10 of his, or 11 of his train, there are 12 of them, abandon him. He's left with one faithful retainer. He slays the dragon. And leaves only one man, whose name is Wiglaf. Wiglaf persists with him to the end. If you think about Peter and Jesus, Peter says he'll never leave him. He does. Wiglaf is not like Peter. He sticks by his friend's side. There's something heroic about Wiglaf. The only warrior brave enough to help him in the fight against the dragon. He conforms to the heroic code that he's willing to die in accordance with the oath that he has sworn. So he passes on the oath of loyalty. And he, more importantly, is willing to die to save his Lord. And so he is a reflection of Beowulf himself, willing to lay down his life in accordance with his oath. And he says it's always better to act than to grieve. And he acts. So he's the future of the kingdom. So as I say, there's a sense of Beowulf being compared to the earlier king, and yet his foe was far greater. He did lose his life, but the Wiglaf will carry on heroism, and a good man will be his successor. So although it's a sort of a diminished, it's a sort of a minor key note at the end of the whole epic, there's at least a glint of hope against the backdrop. And as I say, normally in Norse mythology and in Anglo-Saxon, there's doom and gloom and no hope for the future. Well, here's a glint of the hope of the future. I think this also comes from the Christian poet. So he's casting a hopeful note towards the future. Okay? Okay, we'll leave you for that.